Hey everyone, welcome to Dark Dossier. Before we dive into the video, comment your city down below. I wanna see where you're all tuning in from. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss out. Let's get started. Story 1. The Peculiar Trial of the Singing Pickpocket in Prague. It is Prague, the waning years of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, a city alive with contradictions. Cobblestone streets echo with the clatter of carriages, the quiet chatter of shopkeepers, and the ever-present sound of violins drifting from taverns. At night, oil lamps paint golden halos in the fog, casting shadows that move almost as if they carry their own secrets. For many, Prague was a city of romance, but for others it was a city of survival. Among these others was a man who would become infamous not for his crimes, but for his songs. Karel Novak, the singing pickpocket. Karel was not the sort of criminal who struck fear into the hearts of citizens. He was no knife-wielding thug nor a schemer plotting grand robberies. His crimes were petty, almost laughably so. A wallet here, a pocket watch there, the occasional silk handkerchief snatched from the distracted hand of a gentleman after too much wine. What made him peculiar, however, was not the thefts themselves, but the manner in which he committed them. Karel sang. He sang in the marketplace, crooning folk ballads as he drifted among the crowd. He sang in taverns, borrowing verses from traveling musicians while slipping fingers into coats. He sang in the streets at dusk, voice carrying over the river, all while deftly relieving the distracted of their belongings. It was this strange blending of art and crime that baffled, and in some ways charmed, the people of Prague. To some, he was a nuisance. To others, an odd sort of folk hero. But as with all such stories, admiration fades quickly when embarrassment mounts. By the time the police finally brought him to trial, the public was no longer amused by the singing thief. Instead, the trial became a citywide spectacle, a curious case that revealed not just the eccentricity of one man, but the undercurrents of desperation and ingenuity in Prague's working class. The early life of Karel Novak. Karel was born in the backstreets of Prague in 1867, into poverty so severe that even bread was a luxury. His father, a cobbler, died young. His mother cleaned laundries until her hands cracked from soap and water. By the time Karel was 9, he was working odd jobs, sweeping taverns, running errands, and singing for pennies on street corners. It was there on the street that Karel discovered two things: his ability to charm people with music and his nimble fingers. The first gave him pennies, the second gave him survival. By the time he was a teenager, he had been arrested twice for petty theft but released as too young for prison. It was the third arrest, years later, that cemented his reputation not for the severity of the crime, but for the performance that accompanied it. The pickpocket who couldn't stop singing. According to police records, Karel had a peculiar habit even under questioning. When nervous, he would hum or even break into song. Officers noted with irritation how he sang fragments of folk songs during interrogations, sometimes shifting lyrics to mock his captors. One sergeant recalled in his statement, "The man is either mad or clever. When I pressed him for confession, he began to sing. The bird flies free, the hunter never knows where. I believe he used his songs to cover his true words, to distract or confuse us." In truth, singing became both his mask and his identity. Witnesses often recalled hearing him before they saw him. The melody distracted, the voice drew attention upward, while his hands moved lightly and unnoticed. Some victims even swore that the moment they realized their wallets were gone, the thief had already vanished into the crowd, leaving only the echo of a song. The arrest that sparked a sensation. The arrest that led to his trial was as peculiar as the man himself. It occurred in 1893, outside a tavern near Charles Bridge. By then, Karel had become notorious enough that tavern owners warned patrons to keep one hand on your purse and the other on your beer. That evening, he performed a raucous rendition of a Moravian drinking song. The crowd clapped, coins jingled into his cap, and laughter filled the smoky tavern air. But the moment of cheer turned quickly. A wealthy textile merchant cried out his watch chain was dangling loose, his gold watch missing. The crowd erupted, pointing at Carol. Yet instead of fleeing, he laughed, raised his hands, and sang another line of his song. The police were summoned, and Carol was taken away, still humming as if it were all a game. The arrest was written in the newspapers within hours. "The singing thief of Prague finally caught," declared Prager Tagblatt, nodding with wry amusement how the accused had sung even as he was handcuffed. The trial begins. The trial was unlike most proceedings in Prague's modest criminal courts. Normally, trials for petty theft were short, perfunctory matters, but Carol's notoriety and the peculiar details of his case transformed it into a public event. Newspapers covered it with glee, cafes buzzed with speculation, and on the first day, the gallery was packed with curious onlookers. The prosecution painted Carol as a menace, a shameless thief who used charm and song to humiliate honest citizens. They argued that his thefts were numerous, that his crimes were not petty but persistent, and that his behavior mocked the dignity of the law. The defense, however, leaned into the absurdity. They presented Carol as a harmless eccentric, a man more performer than criminal. His thefts, they argued, were minor, exaggerated by the press, and his songs brought joy to a weary city. "If laughter and music are crimes," his lawyer quipped, "then perhaps this whole city should be behind bars." The court laughed, but the merchant whose watch had been taken did not. Why the case mattered? Beneath the humor and spectacle, the case touched on deeper issues. The tension between poverty and survival, between crime and entertainment, between justice and mercy. Was Carol a dangerous criminal, or simply a poor man using song to cover his desperation? Was the trial about theft, or about the embarrassment of the city's wealthier class, tired of being made fools in public? It was clear the trial was about more than stolen coins. It became a mirror of the city's anxieties, about order, about dignity, about the boundary between art and crime. As the trial stretched into days, questions lingered. Witnesses came forward not just to accuse but also to defend him. Some claimed he had stolen from them. Others swore he had entertained them and never touched their pockets. The courtroom became a stage, and Carol the star actor. The criminal court in Prague was not built for spectacle. It was a modest building, its walls lined with dark wood and its benches creaking beneath the weight of curious citizens who crowded in to watch the trial of Karol Nowak, the singing pickpocket. Yet on those days in early autumn of 1893, it might as well have been an opera house. Every bench was filled, and those without seats pressed against the walls or craned their necks through doorways, eager to hear how the city's most peculiar thief would defend himself. What made the proceedings unusual was the air of levity that lingered in the courtroom. Normally, criminal trials for theft were swift, sober, and handled with little tolerance for distractions. But here, laughter punctuated testimony, and whispers filled the air whenever Carol shifted in his seat. It was as though the very novelty of his singing made it impossible for the court to treat him as an ordinary criminal. The accusers stepped forward. The prosecution called a parade of witnesses. First was the textile merchant whose missing gold watch had triggered the arrest. His testimony was simple but damning. "I felt his hand," the merchant insisted. "He sang into my face with such boldness, and in that very moment my watch was gone." He held up the empty chain that had once carried the heirloom. "And I ask the court, if this man is left free to sing, who will be safe in the streets?" Other witnesses followed, each with their own story. A woman claimed her purse had disappeared while she clapped along to one of his tavern songs. A baker swore he lost 3 coins during a lively ballad in the marketplace. Yet with each accusation, the defense found ways to inject doubt. "Is it not possible," Carol's lawyer asked one woman, "that your purse slipped as you clapped so vigorously? Music stirs the body, does it not?" Some in the gallery laughed, while others grumbled. Carol's performance in court. But it was not the testimony that captivated the city, it was Carol himself. Every time he rose to speak, he seemed unable to resist song. When asked for his plea, he cleared his throat and sang softly, "A bird in the sky, a coin in the pocket. Who owns it truly, the bird or the man?" Gasps filled the courtroom. The judge struck his gavel, demanding silence, but the moment was unforgettable. Carroll was not just on trial, he was performing. One observer wrote in a newspaper account, "The man sings as though the court is his stage. His guilt or innocence seems almost secondary. The true trial is whether charm can defeat justice." A divided city. As the trial stretched on, the city itself became divided. Newspapers editorialized furiously. The conservative Prager Tagblatt demanded harsh punishment, calling Carroll a parasite who humiliates honest citizens with his mockery of law. Meanwhile, the more liberal Narodny Listy printed sympathetic pieces, suggesting that Carroll's crimes were exaggerated, and his trial a distraction from deeper problems of poverty and inequality in Prague. In taverns, workers laughed and repeated the thief's lyrics, treating him like a folk character. Among the wealthy, however, his antics were no laughing matter. To them, he embodied a threat to respectability itself, the idea that the poor could not only steal from them but mock them openly while doing so. Investigators take the stand. Beyond witness testimony, the court also heard from police officers who had tried and failed to catch him before. One inspector described months of frustration. "We heard him before we saw him," he said. "Every time we tried to track him, he sang and slipped into the crowd. It was as if his voice was smoke and we could never grasp him." Another officer revealed that Carroll often used his songs strategically, singing more loudly in one direction to draw attention, then slipping behind listeners to commit his thefts. "He was clever," the officer admitted reluctantly, "and we could never prove how many pockets he emptied." The defense seized on this. "So, you cannot prove the number of thefts. You cannot say how many, or even if some were not accidents." The officer bristled but conceded the difficulty of certainty. The defense's case. When it was the defense's turn, they did not deny that Carroll had stolen. Instead, they painted him as a product of poverty, a man driven to survival by hunger but who chose to mask it with music rather than violence. His lawyer argued passionately, "He is not a thug who draws blood. He is not a bandit who terrorizes families. He sings. He makes people laugh even as he makes mistakes. Is this a man to crush with prison, or is this a man whom society should pity?" The defense even called witnesses who testified to Carroll's kindness. A widow told the court that he once slipped bread into her basket when she could not afford it. A tavern owner claimed Carroll sang for hours without asking a coin. These testimonies clashed with those of his accusers, deepening the uncertainty. A trial on the edge of farce. The trial soon began to resemble theater more than justice. On the third day, when the judge grew impatient with Carroll's constant humming, Carroll responded by breaking into a hymn. The gallery laughed, the judge fumed, and the newspapers had yet another headline: "The singing pickpocket silences judge with hymn." It was no longer clear whether the city was laughing at Carroll, at the court, or at the absurdity of the entire spectacle. What was clear was that the trial was no longer about theft, it was about meaning. Was Carroll simply a petty criminal, or was he a mirror reflecting the city's contradictions? Was the trial a defense of law, or a stage where power, poverty, and performance collided? The jury deliberates. Finally, after days of testimony, it was left to the jury. Their deliberation was not just about guilt, but about how guilty he was. Should he be punished severely, as a warning to other thieves? Or should he be treated lightly, as an eccentric who harmed more pride than people? Behind closed doors, accounts suggest the jury was bitterly divided. Some wanted prison. Others felt a short sentence was enough. A few even sympathized with him, believing his songs had brought joy in a city too often weary with hardship. The court waited, the city waited, and as it waited, Carol himself sat quietly, for once not singing. Perhaps even he understood that the performance could not last forever. The cliffhanger. By the fifth day, the jury was still locked in debate. The judge announced they would return the following morning with a decision. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse, filling the square. Vendors sold bread and hot wine to those waiting to hear the verdict, and for one strange evening, Prague felt less like a city awaiting justice and more like a city awaiting a show. But what would the verdict be? Would Karel Novak be condemned as a criminal or remembered as a peculiar entertainer whose songs echoed louder than his crimes? Morning broke over Prague with a chill mist clinging to the rooftops. Outside the courthouse, the crowd gathered early. By now, the singing pickpocket had become more than a defendant. He was a symbol, a curiosity, and for some, a small rebellion against the order of things. Merchants, laborers, tavern keepers, and even a few curious aristocrats assembled in the square, eager to hear how the jury would decide. Inside, the courtroom was thick with tension. Carol sat slouched but alert, eyes fixed on the bench. For once, he did not hum or sing. He knew, as everyone did, that the moment had come when performance would no longer protect him. The judge entered, robes heavy and stern. The gavel struck. The jury filed in, faces unreadable. Then, with measured words, the foreman delivered the verdict. Guilty of theft. But not of every charge. The jury had refused to convict him on several counts where evidence was vague or testimony conflicted. Instead, they found him guilty only in the most direct cases, including the theft of the merchant's watch. The sentence. The courtroom fell silent as the judge pronounced the sentence. Carol would serve 3 years in prison, with the possibility of early release for good behavior. 3 years. For the wealthy, it was too light a slap on the wrist for a man who had embarrassed them. For the poor, it was too heavy, too harsh for a man whose thefts were more performance than menace. The divide was as clear as ever. And yet in that silence, Carol did something unexpected. As guards moved to take him away, he raised his voice and sang. The bird in the cage still finds its song. The walls are high, but the tune is strong. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the room. Some laughed nervously, others shook their heads in disbelief. Even the judge, weary of the man's antics, could only sigh as the guards pulled him from the chamber. Life behind bars. Prison in late 19th century Prague was no gentle punishment. The cells were cold, food meager, and discipline strict. But reports from guards suggested that Carol remained true to his nature. He sang. At night, his voice carried down the stone corridors. Some prisoners cursed at him, demanding silence, while others found comfort in the strange lullabies that echoed through the dark. Even guards, though they never admitted it officially, recalled nights when his songs broke the monotony of silence. There are accounts that Carol earned small privileges for his behavior. He helped in the prison kitchen, scrubbed floors, and occasionally sang during chapel services. Though confined, his songs traveled further than the walls intended. Release and vanishing. In 1896, after serving just under 3 years, Carol was released on parole. Newspapers covered his release briefly, but by then, the city's fascination had waned. New scandals occupied headlines, new crimes captured attention. For a time, Carol sang again in taverns. Some said he tried to go straight, singing for coins without dipping into pockets. Others swore they saw him lurking near the marketplace, old habits stirring again. But then, curiously, he disappeared from record. By the turn of the century, the singing pickpocket was little more than a memory, a story retold by older men over beer, embellished with each telling. Was he arrested again under another name? Did he leave Prague to seek new cities where his songs might buy him freedom a little longer? No one knew for certain. Why the case endured? So why did the trial of Karel Novak linger in Prague's memory long after the man himself faded? perhaps because it revealed something uncomfortable about society. He was, in many ways, a mirror of the city itself, clever, contradictory, balancing dignity and desperation. His thefts embarrassed the wealthy, but his songs comforted the poor. His trial was not just about stolen watches, it was about the meaning of justice in a city where poverty pressed against prosperity every day. It was also about performance, the way a man could turn crime into theater and a courtroom into a stage. In Carroll's songs, people heard both defiance and despair. In his trial, they saw both comedy and tragedy. Lessons from a peculiar trial. The case influenced more than just tavern gossip. Legal commentators of the time used it as an example of how public perception can shape justice. Judges warned against allowing trials to become spectacles, lest juries be swayed by charm rather than fact. Policemen reflected on how difficult it was to prosecute crimes that relied on distraction and crowd manipulation, foreshadowing modern concerns about con artists and fraudsters. For criminologists, the case became a study in character. Was Carroll a criminal who used music to mask theft, or a musician who could not resist theft to survive? The question lingered in essays and articles long after his disappearance. A quiet reflection. Imagine for a moment standing on the Charles Bridge at dusk in those years after his release. The river flows dark beneath you, the city lamps glow faintly through the fog, and the air is filled with the sound of footsteps, chatter, the clink of coins in pockets. And then just faintly you hear a voice, a folk song, drifting from somewhere unseen. Is it a passerby, a memory, or perhaps, for an instant, the echo of the singing pickpocket, still weaving his peculiar mixture of charm and crime into the fabric of Prague? That was the lasting mystery of Karel Novak. Not just what he stole, but what he left behind, a question of whether a thief could ever become, in his own strange way, a folk legend. Closing thought. The trial of the singing pickpocket did not reshape laws, nor did it alter the great tides of European history. But in its smallness, in its peculiarity, it captured something universal: the way crime and art, poverty and pride, justice and performance intersect in human lives. And so, long after the verdict was delivered, one question lingers still. Was Karel Novak merely a thief? Or was he, however briefly, the voice of a city caught between order and chaos? Story 2. The Clockmaker's Secret. A Vienna fraud gone wrong. Vienna in the late 19th century was a city of refinement and reputation. Its boulevards bustled with finely dressed citizens, carriages rolled past opera houses, and cafes brimmed with intellectual debate. Beneath this glittering surface, however, there thrived a darker economy, one of frauds, scams, and desperate schemes. Among these, none was more peculiar or more humiliating to the city's proud citizens than the case of Johann Meisel, the fraudulent clockmaker. Johann was not a master thief, nor a daring burglar. His crimes did not involve breaking into houses under cover of night or robbing coaches on dim country roads. Instead, his weapon was patience, charm, and an uncanny ability to exploit the trust people placed in objects as ordinary and innocent as clocks. For nearly a decade, he built a small empire of deceit in the heart of Vienna, convincing clients that he could repair or even improve their timepieces. Instead, he used those same clocks as instruments of fraud, turning Vienna's obsession with punctuality into his personal fortune. The obsession with time. In the late 1800s, timekeeping in Europe was undergoing a transformation. Railways demanded precision, factories relied on synchronized schedules, and punctuality became not just a virtue but a necessity. Vienna, proud of its sophistication, was particularly sensitive to the importance of keeping accurate time. Households displayed ornate pendulum clocks as symbols of refinement. Pocket watches, carried on golden chains, were the pride of gentlemen. Even small businesses boasted clock faces above their counters, each one a promise of reliability. Into this culture of precision, stepped Johann Meisel, a man who understood not just mechanics but human psychology. The rise of a clockmaker. Born in 1851 in the outskirts of Vienna, Johann apprenticed under a modest watchmaker. By all accounts, he was talented, nimble with gears, quick with repairs, and imaginative in his designs. But he was also restless. Genuine repairs paid little, and he found himself constantly drawn to shortcuts. It was said he could repair a pocket watch blindfolded, yet he rarely delivered watches on time. Instead, he cultivated a strange reputation, part craftsman, part charlatan, part entertainer. Clients came as much for his personality as for his work. By the 1880s, Johann had established his own small shop. Outside, a painted sign read, "Time repaired, time improved, time perfected." Inside, customers found not only clocks in various states of disassembly, but also a man who spoke in riddles about time itself. "Time," he once told a wealthy client, "is like money. If you spend it poorly, it slips away. But if you invest it wisely in a good watch, for instance, it grows." Few realized, until much later, that Johann was already speaking of his frauds. The scheme unfolds. Johann's deception was remarkably simple. Customers brought him their watches or clocks for repair. He would accept them with great ceremony, promising improvement. In some cases, he returned them worse than before, ensuring repeat business. In others, he secretly swapped fine mechanisms for cheap replacements, selling the genuine parts on the black market. But his most audacious trick was one he called the perpetual adjustment. Johann claimed he had developed a unique technique to perfect clocks so that they lost no time at all. For an extra fee, he promised near-magical accuracy. In reality, he tampered with the mechanism so they would run slightly too fast. Customers, initially delighted by their clock's precision, soon found themselves adjusting their schedules, arriving early to appointments, opening shops before competitors. By the time they realized something was wrong, Johann would blame natural settling and charge for another adjustment. It was, in essence, a con built not on theft but on the manipulation of trust and routine. Vienna falls for the trick. To modern ears, it may sound absurd that anyone could fall for such schemes. But in the Vienna of the 1880s, Johann's fraud was perfectly suited to the moment. People desperately wanted accuracy, and the very concept of scientific improvement carried authority. He soon gained prestigious clients, lawyers, doctors, even minor officials. Some swore their improved clocks had made them more productive. One factory owner testified that Johann's perfected timepieces had boosted efficiency, though, in truth, his workers were merely arriving earlier. For nearly a decade, Johann grew bolder. He took on apprentices, opened a second shop, and lived lavishly in a district far above his means. His reputation as the man who perfects time spread. But every scheme, no matter how clever, eventually unravels. The beginning of the end. The collapse of Johann's fraud began with a single clock, an ornate grandfather clock belonging to Countess Helene von Strass, a wealthy patron of the arts. The clock, imported from Paris, was her pride. When Johann claimed he could perfect it, she paid him handsomely. At first she was delighted. The clock chimed predictably, impressing guests, but soon subtle irregularities appeared. The clock ran fast by minutes at a time. When she complained, Johann confidently offered another adjustment. The Countess, however, was no ordinary client. Her brother was a magistrate, and she had connections in the police. Suspicion grew. Why did so many of Johann's customers complain of similar, slight adjustments? Why were expensive watch parts appearing in pawnshops across the city? Her complaint triggered an investigation. Police investigation. Vienna's police were accustomed to dealing with pickpockets, forgers, and burglars. Fraud of this kind, so subtle, so entwined with daily life, was unusual. Detectives visited Johann's shop under the guise of clients, submitting watches for repair. Within weeks, the evidence was clear. Their watches came back with parts swapped, mechanisms altered. Pawn shops confirmed they had purchased rare components traced to Johann's clients. Yet arresting him was not simple. His charm was disarming, and many of his wealthier clients were reluctant to admit they had been duped. Pride stood in the way of justice. Still, by 1891, investigators had gathered enough. Johann was arrested quietly in his shop, tools still in hand. The trial begins. When Johann Meisel's trial opened, it lacked the theatricality of the singing pickpocket in Prague, but it carried its own strange fascination. The courtroom filled with victims, some furious, others embarrassed, a few oddly defensive of the man who had fooled them. The prosecution painted him as a fraud who preyed on Vienna's obsession with punctuality, robbing not just money but dignity. They presented pawned parts, altered mechanisms, and testimony from detectives. The defense, meanwhile, insisted that Johann was simply an eccentric craftsman whose experiments with timekeeping were misunderstood. If progress is a crime, his lawyer argued, then every inventor is guilty. The city watched closely, fascinated by the man who had, for nearly a decade, sold not just repairs but illusions. The cliffhanger. The courtroom in Vienna that autumn was not a place of drama in the usual sense. Fraud cases tended to be dry, filled with technical discussions about money, contracts, and small print. But the trial of Johann Meisel was different. It touched not only on financial loss but on wounded pride, and it exposed how easily even the most sophisticated Viennese citizens could be duped by a man who claimed he could perfect time. From the first day, the benches were filled with curious onlookers, lawyers, students, even rival watchmakers. They wanted to see how a simple tradesman had managed to trick aristocrats and merchants alike, all through their clocks. The charges. Johann faced multiple charges: fraud, theft by deception, and resale of stolen property. In total, more than 40 victims had come forward, though investigators suspected the true number was far higher. The prosecution presented its case systematically. They demonstrated how Johann had removed original mechanisms from pocket watches, replacing them with cheap substitutes. They introduced receipts from pawn shops, where rare French and Swiss parts had been sold under false names. They even displayed one of the Countess von Strass's clocks, dismantled to show the mismatched gears Johann had installed. But what gripped the public most was not the evidence itself, it was the humiliation of Vienna's elite. Humiliated clients. The witnesses were a gallery of the city's respectable citizens. Doctors, lawyers, merchants, and aristocrats stood in the witness box, admitting they had been duped. Their voices quivered, not from financial loss but from shame. One lawyer, red-faced, confessed that he had proudly shown off his perfected pocket watch to colleagues for months, until he realized it was running fast and contained nothing but brass. A factory owner revealed he had reorganized his entire shift schedule based on Johann's improved timepieces, only to discover his workers had been arriving unnecessarily early for weeks. The courtroom often erupted in muffled laughter at these testimonies. The witnesses, who had come to condemn Johann, ended up exposing their own gullibility. Johann's demeanor. And there, at the center of it all, sat Johann Meisel. Unlike the singing pickpocket in Prague, he did not turn his trial into a performance. Instead, he remained calm, almost detached. He rarely spoke, and when he did, it was in a measured, deliberate voice. Observers noted that he seemed more like a lecturer than a criminal. "Time is fragile," he told the court during cross-examination. "Clocks are imperfect. I never promised miracles. If people believed their lives had improved, was that not worth something?" His words infuriated some, fascinated others. To many, they sounded like the philosophy of a man who had convinced himself his frauds were not crimes, but experiments. The defense strategy. Johann's lawyer built his case around that very idea. He argued that Johann was not a thief but an innovator and eccentric craftsman whose unusual methods had been misunderstood. The clocks had indeed been altered, but not with malicious intent. The lawyer insisted Johann had been conducting improvements, some of which had simply failed. Is every failed experiment fraud? The defense asked the jury. If a scientist makes a promise and does not deliver, is he a criminal, or is he simply mistaken? Herr Meisel is guilty, perhaps, of ambition, but of theft, that is another matter. This line of defense gained traction with some observers. After all, Vienna prided itself on being a city of progress and innovation. Could Johann be seen, not as a fraudster but as a failed visionary? The prosecution's counter. The prosecution was relentless. They presented detailed records of Johann's finances, showing that he had profited handsomely from his schemes. They brought in apprentices who testified that Johann had instructed them to swap parts deliberately and to sell genuine mechanisms on the black market. One apprentice recalled Johann's words, "Never give them back what they bring you. Give them something that ticks, and they will believe it works." This testimony cut through Johann's philosophical defense like a blade. It suggested not eccentricity, but cold calculation. Public fascination. The trial became a daily topic in cafes across Vienna. Some ridiculed the victims, particularly the wealthy, for their gullibility. Others debated Johann's true motives. Was he merely greedy, or had he genuinely convinced himself that his adjustments improved lives, even as they deceived? The newspapers had a field day. Cartoons appeared depicting Johann as a devil winding the gears of Vienna's clocks. Satirical essays mocked the aristocracy for falling prey to a common tradesman. The case became less about Johann himself and more about Vienna's pride. A city's anxiety. Beneath the humor, however, there was unease. If a man could tamper with something as ordinary as a clock and cause disruption across households, businesses, and even factories, what did that say about the fragility of daily life? If time itself could be manipulated, what else could be? Some intellectuals argued that Johann's case was a metaphor for the era, a time of rapid change, where progress promised perfection but often delivered chaos. In that sense, Johann was not just a fraudster but a symbol of modern anxiety. The judge's challenge. The judge presiding over the trial faced a dilemma. Fraud was not unusual, but rarely had it been so public, so humiliating, or so symbolically charged. He knew that a light sentence would be seen as weakness, yet too harsh a punishment might turn Johann into a martyr of sorts. Day after day, the evidence mounted. By the third week, it was clear Johann had deceived dozens, perhaps hundreds. The question was no longer whether he was guilty, but how severely he should be punished. The cliffhanger. As the trial drew toward its conclusion, the city waited for the inevitable verdict. But whispers circulated. Some jurors were sympathetic, seeing Johann as eccentric rather than malicious. Others demanded an example be made of him to restore the city's dignity. Which way would the scales tip? Would Johann be condemned as a criminal mastermind of deception, or treated as a tragic figure, an ambitious craftsman who fooled not only his clients but himself? The final days of Johann Meisel's trial were tense, though not in the dramatic way of violent crimes or murder cases. Instead, the tension came from the way the case touched everyone in Vienna, from factory owners to cafe patrons. It was no longer just about stolen watch parts, it was about trust itself. When the jury returned, the entire courtroom hushed. They had deliberated for 2 days, weighing evidence, testimony, and Johann's strange blend of philosophy and fraud. The verdict was delivered clearly. Guilty on the majority of charges. The jury convicted Johann of fraud and theft by deception, though they acquitted him on some counts where victims had only anecdotal evidence. The sentence. The judge wasted little time. Johann was sentenced to 5 years in prison, a severe punishment for nonviolent fraud, but one the judge justified as necessary to restore the city's dignity and to remind all that deception, however charming, cannot stand. The sentence was met with mixed reactions. Some in the courtroom applauded, others shook their heads. For the victims, especially the wealthy, it was a relief but a bitter one. They had not only lost money but had been made fools of before the entire city. Johann, as always, remained calm. He did not protest or weep. Instead, he gave a faint smile and said softly, "Time punishes all men, sooner or later. Mine has simply arrived early." Life behind walls. Prison life was a sharp contrast to Johann's former comforts. The man who once handled delicate Swiss gears now labored at heavy work, hauling, cleaning, menial tasks. Guards later recalled that he sometimes tinkered with broken tools, repairing them better than new. Yet his arrogance lingered. One guard reported Johann boasting, "Even these walls run on my time. The clock above the gate broken. I fixed it." Fellow prisoners, many hardened criminals, mocked him for his so-called grand crime of clocks. Yet some found his story amusing. He became a figure of curiosity behind bars, neither feared nor hated, but regarded with the suspicion reserved for men who win trust too easily. After release, Johann was released in 1896, older, thinner, and less confident. His reputation in Vienna was destroyed. Few would trust him with so much as a pocket watch. For a time, he tried to resume honest work. Records suggest he opened a modest stall in a poorer district, repairing clocks for laborers and shopkeepers. But he never regained the prominence or the income he once enjoyed. By 1900, his name vanished from city directories. Some whispered he fled to Budapest or Munich. Others claimed he drank himself into obscurity. His final years remain a mystery, though scattered reports hint at an old clockmaker, destitute, seen muttering in taverns about time cheated him as much as he cheated time. Why Vienna remembered. Despite Johann's disappearance, his case lingered in memory. For years, Viennese newspapers used his name as shorthand for fraud. A bungled business deal might be called a Meisel clock. Even jokes in cafes turned on his legacy. Is your watch late, or is Meisel still winding it? But more importantly, his case shifted public perception of fraud. It demonstrated how crime was not always violent, not always obvious. Fraud could creep quietly into the routines of daily life, hiding in trusted objects. Policemen began paying closer attention to conmen, fraudsters, and swindlers, recognizing that charm and deception could be as disruptive as theft at knife point. A reflection on time. There was something poetic about Johann's crime. He had not stolen jewels or money directly. He had stolen time, or rather, the illusion of it. His victims believed they were gaining precision, when in fact they were losing minutes, hours, dignity. And so his legacy was not merely that of a criminal, but of a peculiar trickster who exposed how fragile trust could be when tied to something as relentless as a clock. The lingering question. To this day, historians of crime in Vienna debate Johann's true nature. Was he merely a swindler chasing money, or a man who genuinely believed he was improving lives through his perpetual adjustments? The answer may never be clear. What is clear, however, is that Johann Meisel, the fraudulent clockmaker, left behind a warning. Time cannot be perfected, no matter how clever the mechanism or the man who sells it. Closing thought. Vienna moved on, but the lesson remained. Crime is not always loud or bloody. Sometimes it ticks softly in the background, disguised as progress. And when the gears are finally exposed, one is left to wonder. Did Johann Meisel fool Vienna? Or did Vienna fool itself, wanting so desperately to believe in the perfection of time? Story 3. The Vanishing Postman of Newcastle. Newcastle, in the north of England during the early 20th century, was a city shaped by industry. Coal dust clung to buildings, ships crowded the Tyne, and the daily rhythm of working life was steady, if exhausting. Among the most reliable figures in this working city were the postmen, the men in uniform who trudged through fog, rain, and soot to deliver letters, wages, and parcels. It was a job built on trust. A letter was not just paper. It could be a soldier's word to his family, a businessman's contract, or a worker's pay packet. The postman was a symbol of honesty. That was why, when one of them disappeared, taking with him dozens of letters and parcels, the city was stunned. This was the case of James Harland, the vanishing postman of Newcastle, a quiet scandal that revealed how fragile trust could be in even the most ordinary of institutions. The man before the vanishing. James Harland was, by all accounts, unremarkable. He was 34 when he vanished, unmarried, modest in appearance, with a thin frame and a pale face that seemed to vanish into crowds as easily as his body eventually did. Colleagues at the Postal Service described him as punctual, serious, and somewhat solitary. He rarely joined the others for drinks after work, preferring instead to return to his lodgings with a book or newspaper. Born in a mining family, James had managed to escape the pits by securing a position with the Postal Service in his early 20s. It was steady work, better paid than coal mining, and carried a sense of dignity. To his mother, who still lived in the small cottage where he grew up, James's uniform was a badge of respectability. Nothing about him suggested scandal, or at least, nothing that anyone noticed. The day of the disappearance. It was a Thursday in March 1903 when James was last seen. He had collected a heavy bag of post from the sorting office early that morning. His route was ordinary, a mix of residential streets and small shops stretching across the west side of Newcastle. He was spotted mid-morning by a grocer who remembered him chatting briefly before moving on. Around noon, a seamstress claimed she saw him humming quietly as he handed her a letter. After that, no one saw him again. By evening, alarm bells rang at the sorting office. James had not returned with his empty bag, nor had he been seen at his lodgings. A supervisor retraced his route and discovered something shocking. More than 24 households complained that their post had not been delivered that day. James Harland had vanished along with an entire sack of letters and parcels. Panic in the city. The disappearance was not merely a curiosity, it was a crisis. In 1903, the Postal Service was one of the most trusted institutions in Britain. To suggest that a postman had run off with people's mail was unthinkable. The newspapers seized on the story immediately. Headlines declared, "Postman and Post sack missing mystery DEPNS." Rumors spread rapidly. Some claimed James had been attacked and robbed. Others whispered that he had been carrying money, wages, or bonds and had absconded with it. For working families, the scandal struck deep. To lose letters was painful, but to lose money in the post was devastating. Several households reported missing pay packets, and a small business complained that invoices had vanished with James. The city began to ask, was he a victim or a thief? The investigation begins. Police combed Newcastle for signs of James. They questioned his colleagues, searched his lodgings, and dredged parts of the Tyne. His small rented room yielded nothing unusual: a few clothes, a Bible, and unpaid bills. There was no note, no sign of preparation, no evidence of sudden wealth. Witnesses offered little clarity. Some swore they had seen him walking with his heavy sack near the river. Others thought they glimpsed him in a public house, though none could agree on the details. One theory suggested he had been lured into a trap, robbed of the post sack, and killed, his body hidden. Another, more damning, suggested he had staged his disappearance and fled with the contents of the sack. But if James had planned theft, where had he gone? He left behind no trace. No travel tickets, no purchases, no sightings beyond that hazy afternoon. Letters that never arrived. The true impact of his disappearance became clear in the weeks that followed. Complaints poured in: missing letters of credit, legal documents, family letters never received. Some families claimed never to have heard again from relatives abroad because of the missing post. The most sensational claim came from a small bank, which reported that a registered letter containing £150, a considerable sum, had been entrusted to James's delivery that morning. If true, then the disappearance was no longer merely suspicious, it was grand theft. But here, too, the evidence was shaky. No one could prove the letter had been placed in James's bag. Was it truly missing, or had it been misplaced in the sorting office? The uncertainty only deepened the mystery. Public opinion splits. As the weeks dragged on with no trace of James, Newcastle split into two camps. Some insisted he had been murdered, pointing to the dangers of carrying valuable letters alone. Others condemned him as a thief, arguing that his disappearance could only have been deliberate. In the pubs, jokes circulated about the postman who posted himself, while in churches, preachers warned against the sin of betrayal. For James's mother, who still waited in her cottage for news, the scandal was unbearable. She swore her son was honest, incapable of theft. "He never touched a thing that wasn't his," she told reporters, her voice trembling. Yet the city remained divided, torn between pity for the vanished man and anger at the betrayal of their trust. A lingering mystery. Months passed, then years. The sack of letters was never found. James's name gradually faded from the headlines, though in certain circles he remained a figure of whispered speculation. Some claimed he had fled abroad under another name, perhaps to America or Canada, where work for skilled men was plentiful. Others believed he had drowned in the Tyne, his body swept away, leaving only suspicion behind. The truth was never uncovered. What remained was a wound in the city's faith in its institutions. The cliffhanger. The disappearance of James Harland, the Newcastle postman who vanished with an entire bag of mail, had by spring of 1903 turned into a national curiosity. The post office was an institution woven into the very fabric of Britain. For a uniformed employee to disappear without a trace seemed almost impossible. Yet the empty trail James left behind proved more confounding with every lead pursued. The police struggle. Detectives first considered the obvious: robbery. A postman carrying letters, parcels, and occasionally wages was an attractive target. But robbery typically left traces, signs of a struggle, discarded mail, or at least witnesses. There was nothing. James seemed to have melted into the industrial mist. Searches along the River Tyne produced nothing. No sack, no body. The police even questioned sailors and dock workers in case James had boarded a ship. None remembered seeing him. Investigators examined train stations, thinking he might have fled by rail. Again, no ticket sellers or porters recalled a pale, uniformed postman with a heavy bag. The absence of evidence began to feel almost deliberate, as though James had walked off his route and into another life. Theories multiply. As newspapers across the country seized on the story, theories multiplied. The thief theory: James had stolen the mail, perhaps even the £150 registered letter, and fled abroad. Stories of postmen absconding were rare but not unheard of. To many, it was the simplest explanation. The murder theory: others believed James had been ambushed, the sack taken, and his body disposed of. With the docks so close to his route, the Tyne was an easy hiding place. The secret life theory: a more sensational rumor suggested James had lived a double life, perhaps a lover in another town, or debts he could not repay. The missing post was merely the excuse for his escape. Each theory was plausible, and yet none fit perfectly. Colleagues and clues. When investigators interviewed his fellow postmen, they painted a picture of James as neither overly friendly nor suspicious. He was quiet, methodical, and seemingly dependable. But one detail stood out. In the weeks before his disappearance, James had appeared distracted. He seemed far away in thought, one colleague recalled. Once I asked him what was wrong and he said, "It doesn't matter, I'll not be here long." At the time, I thought he meant a transfer. Could it have been a hint, or was it merely coincidence? At his lodgings, detectives found another curious clue. Among his belongings was a folded advertisement for cheap ship passage to New York. The pamphlet was well thumbed, as though studied often. Did James plan to start a new life overseas? Or had he simply dreamed of escape like so many others in his position? The missing money. The most damning piece of evidence remained the bank's claim of a missing registered letter containing £150. The post office treated such cases with severity, as registered mail was carefully tracked. The record book showed James had indeed signed for the letter that morning. But had he delivered it? The bank swore it had not arrived. If James had taken it, then the thief theory gained strength. Yet investigators noted that, curiously, no sudden withdrawal of cash or sign of extravagant spending followed. If James had fled with £150, why was there no trace of it? The family's plea. James's mother, now in her 60s, continued to defend him publicly. She gave interviews insisting her son was no thief. "If he had run, he would have written to me," she said. "He was a good lad, whatever people say. Something must have happened to him." Her words struck a chord with many in Newcastle. Was it fair to condemn a man with no proof beyond his disappearance? Or was that very disappearance proof enough? The post office response. The post office, deeply embarrassed, launched its own inquiry. Officials reviewed procedures, fearing the case would undermine public confidence. They concluded that James had either stolen the post or been murdered, with the former more likely. Still, they could not ignore the damage to their reputation. Security tightened, more supervision, stricter tracking of registered letters, and occasional paired deliveries in riskier areas. The case of the vanishing postman left its mark on the system itself. Strange sightings. In the months after the disappearance, occasional reports surfaced of men resembling James. A sailor swore he saw him in Hamburg. A farmer in County Durham claimed a stranger came through asking about work who looked just like the missing postman. None of these sightings were confirmed, but each one kept the mystery alive. Most tantalizing of all was a letter received anonymously by a Newcastle newspaper in late 1904. Written in shaky handwriting, it read, "Tell my mother I am safe. Forgive me. The sea has taken me far. J.H." Was it genuine, or a cruel hoax? Experts examined the handwriting but could not definitively link it to James. His mother, however, insisted it was his. For her, it was enough to believe her son lived. For others, it only deepened the questions. A city divided. By 1905, the case had become folklore in Newcastle. Children were warned not to trust strangers. Remember the postman who disappeared. Tavern patrons debated whether James had drowned or sailed away rich. Even years later, the phrase "gone like the postman" was sometimes used to describe anyone who vanished suddenly. But no answers came. Police closed the active investigation after 3 years, though the mystery lingered in public memory. The cliffhanger. By 1906, 3 years after the disappearance of James Harland, Newcastle had moved on in its daily grind of coal, industry, and shipping. Yet the mystery of the vanishing postman continued to hang in the air like a lingering fog on the Tyne. The case was never solved, no body recovered, and no sack of missing letters ever found. It was a wound in the city's memory, a reminder that even in an age of strict order and duty, people could simply vanish. The last investigative push. Although the official police inquiry had closed, private investigators, journalists, and even amateur sleuths pursued the story. Each year brought fresh rumors. One journalist in 1907 traveled to Liverpool, chasing a lead that James had worked as a dockhand under an assumed name. Another report surfaced in 1909 from Canada, where a Newcastle immigrant swore he had met a man who once wore the postman's red. None of these claims were ever proven. The post office, for its part, remained rigid. They considered James guilty. The missing registered letter containing £150, they argued, was proof enough. For the institution, the explanation was clear. James had betrayed his oath, stolen, and fled. To admit otherwise would mean admitting vulnerability. Yet for the public, and especially for his mother, the truth was less certain. The family's vigil. James's mother never accepted that her son was a thief. She kept his small room exactly as it had been, his folded uniform still on the chair, his books still stacked neatly by the bed. She believed he would one day knock on her door, even if years had passed. Neighbors remembered her walking to the post office weekly, asking if any letter had come. "He will write," she insisted. "He will not forget me." Her faith became its own quiet legend, even as others shook their heads. When she died in 1912, some said she carried her belief to the grave that her son had not betrayed Newcastle, but had been lost to fate. Social consequences. The vanishing postman had broader consequences than most realized. Trust in the postal service, once unquestioned, took a blow. For years afterward, people in Newcastle hesitated before entrusting valuables to the mail. Businesses used couriers more often. Families sent money through banks rather than envelopes. The case also reshaped the way the postal service operated. Regulations tightened. Registered letters were logged with greater precision, and postmen were subjected to stricter oversight. James Harlan's name was never mentioned in official documents, but his ghost lingered in every rulebook. Psychological portrait. Historians later debated what sort of man James truly was. Some argued he was a victim of circumstance, an ordinary postman, perhaps tempted by sudden opportunity or crushed by unseen pressures. Others suggested he was a calculating thief who had studied escape routes long before his final delivery. But the most intriguing theory came from criminologists in the mid-20th century, who described cases like James's as voluntary vanishings. These were not always crimes but acts of self-erasure, men and women who slipped out of their lives, abandoning identities, debts, and responsibilities. For them, the act of vanishing was itself the motive. Could James have been such a man? Quiet, solitary, unnoticed, perhaps he had dreamed of leaving for years. The ship pamphlet in his room hinted at it. The comment to a colleague, "I'll not be here long," suggested it. Perhaps the missing mail was not theft at all, but the price of his escape. The folklore of a vanishing. By the 1920s, James Harlan had become folklore in Newcastle. Children played games where one pretended to be the postman who disappears. Storytellers in pubs spun increasingly elaborate tales. James had joined the circus. James had become a sailor. James had returned in disguise to spy on his old route. The truth mattered less than the story itself. The vanishing postman became a symbol of uncertainty, a reminder that beneath the predictable routines of city life, mystery always lurked. Lessons learned. Criminologists now see the Harlan case as a turning point in understanding institutional crime and disappearance. It revealed how much trust ordinary people invested in uniformed figures, and how devastating it was when that trust collapsed. It also highlighted the limits of early 20th century investigation. Without surveillance, identification systems, or international coordination, a man could simply vanish and begin again. The case also left behind a lingering unease about the postal service. Even decades later, some families in Newcastle joked darkly when letters were late. Perhaps the postman's gone missing again. A reflection in time. Imagine the foggy streets of Newcastle in 1903, coal smoke drifting through the air, footsteps echoing on damp cobblestones. A postman in uniform walks steadily, a heavy bag of letters at his side. People greet him with nods of trust, never imagining that this routine will end in mystery. Hours later, the route unfinished, the post undelivered, the man simply gone. That image lingered in the city's imagination for generations. a reminder of how fragile ordinary trust can be, how quickly the predictable can collapse into the inexplicable. Closing thought. The case of James Harland was never solved. Perhaps he was a thief, perhaps a victim, perhaps simply a man who longed to vanish. But his disappearance left behind a haunting question that still echoes. Is it worse for a trusted man to steal, or for him to disappear without a word, leaving behind only silence? Story 4. The Cemetery Theft in Bucharest. At the dawn of the 20th century, Bucharest was a city caught between two worlds. On one hand, it styled itself the Paris of the East, with grand boulevards, theaters, and aristocrats in carriages. On the other hand, poverty gripped the working classes, and the outskirts of the city still looked like villages, with dirt roads and wooden shacks. In such a place, crime flourished in peculiar forms: petty theft, swindles, smuggling, and in one curious case, a crime that shocked the city for its sheer audacity: the theft of graves. This was not murder, nor grave robbing for valuables in the traditional sense. Instead, it was the story of an organized theft of marble and iron from cemeteries, a crime both bizarre and revealing of a society struggling with inequality. Cemeteries as public treasures. To understand the scandal, one must first understand the role of cemeteries in Bucharest at that time. Cemeteries like Bellu Cemetery, founded in the mid-19th century, were not only resting places for the dead but cultural landmarks. Families erected elaborate tombs, vaults with carved angels, marble crosses, wrought iron gates. For the wealthy, a grand tomb was a way to display status even after death. But marble and iron were valuable materials. A carved slab of marble could fetch a high price. Iron gates could be melted and resold. For the poor, the temptation was strong. The first signs of trouble. The scandal began quietly in 1905. Caretakers at Bellu Cemetery noticed that several iron fences around graves had gone missing. At first, it was thought to be vandalism by drunken youths. But then marble slabs vanished, sometimes entire headstones pried loose and carted away in the night. At first, the thefts targeted older, neglected graves. Families assumed time had eroded the tombs. But as the months went on, even fresh graves were stripped of iron and stone. It became clear: an organized group was systematically looting the cemeteries of Bucharest. Outrage in the press. The Romanian newspapers erupted. Universal and Adevărul ran furious articles with headlines like "Even the dead are not safe" and "Profanation in our cemeteries." The story struck a nerve. It was not just about stolen stone, it was about respect. To desecrate graves was to insult families and to mock the very sanctity of death. Citizens poured into cemeteries to check on their loved ones' resting places. Some hired guards, others threatened to camp by their family vaults at night. Panic mixed with anger, and the city authorities were forced to act. The investigation begins. Police quickly realized this was not random vandalism. The thefts were too systematic. Marble slabs weighing hundreds of kilos could not be stolen by drunkards with chisels. Wagons were needed, and someone had to fence the goods. Surveillance was set up at Bellu and other cemeteries. Officers disguised themselves as mourners, lingering among the tombs at dusk. But the thieves were cautious. Weeks passed with no arrests. Finally, in late 1906, a breakthrough came. A stonemason on the outskirts of the city reported that a man had offered him several used slabs of marble, clearly from graves, with faint inscriptions still visible. The mason refused and alerted police. The grave thieves unmasked. The trail led investigators to a small gang of men from Bucharest's working-class districts. Their leader, a former cemetery gravedigger named Ion Stainescu, knew the grounds intimately. He and his accomplices worked at night, prying slabs loose and hauling them by wagon. The stolen marble was sold to unscrupulous builders who shaved off inscriptions and reused it in construction. The iron fences were melted down and sold as scrap. It was, in effect, an underground industry. When police raided Ian's hideout, they found a yard filled with fragments of gravestones, some already half recut into paving stones. The discovery horrified the public. Public reaction. The arrests made front-page news. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse, shouting curses at the thieves. Families of the desecrated graves demanded justice. Priests denounced the crime from pulpits, calling it a sin against both God and man. What shocked people most was not simply the theft, but the revelation that the materials had been reused in ordinary buildings. Rumors spread that certain tenement blocks in Bucharest had marble floors cut from stolen gravestones. To walk on them, people said, was to tread on the names of the dead. A society exposed. Beneath the outrage, however, was a deeper discomfort. The crime revealed the desperation of Bucharest's poor. Marble and iron were valuable precisely because so many had so little. For the working poor, selling stolen stone meant bread on the table. At the same time, the scandal revealed the vanity of the wealthy. Their grand tombs had been built as monuments to status, but in the end, they had only invited theft. The thefts symbolized the inequality of the city, the poor, quite literally, dismantling the monuments of the rich. The cliffhanger. When the case of Ian Stainescu and his gang came to court in 1907, it was unlike any trial Bucharest had seen in recent years. Theft was common enough, but theft from the dead, that was something else entirely. The galleries were packed with citizens, priests, and journalists, all eager to see justice delivered. The city was transfixed by the spectacle, not just the crime itself, but what it represented. To rob from the living was one thing, but to strip marble and iron from cemeteries was seen as a desecration of sacred ground, an offense against memory and dignity. The prosecution's case. The prosecutors built their case carefully. They presented the stolen slabs of marble and fragments of ironwork recovered from Ian's yard. Some pieces still bore faint inscriptions of names and dates, proving they had once stood in Bellu Cemetery. Others matched recent reports from families who had complained of missing fences. Witnesses testified that they had seen wagons moving through the streets at night, laden with heavy stone. One stonemason described how he had been offered used slabs that still carried traces of epitaphs. But the most damning evidence came from Ian's own accomplices. Two of the younger men in the gang turned informants, describing in detail how Ian had led them into cemeteries under the cover of night. He knew which graves were easiest, one confessed. He said the old ones were best nobody visits them, but sometimes we took new ones too. He said the stone was finer. The defense strategy. Ian's lawyer, however, attempted to reframe the crime. He argued that the thefts were not desecrations but acts of survival. His clients were poor men, desperate for food and shelter. They had not stolen from the living, they had scavenged from the forgotten dead. Is it not true, the lawyer asked, that many of these graves were abandoned, left to weeds and neglect? The marble was crumbling, the iron rusting. My clients merely reclaimed what society had thrown away. The courtroom murmured, divided between outrage and uncomfortable sympathy. The testimonies of grief. But when families of the desecrated graves took the stand, sympathy evaporated. A widow wept as she described visiting her husband's grave only to find the marble cross gone. A father testified that the iron fence around his daughter's tomb had been wrenched away, leaving the grave exposed to stray dogs. Priests added their voices, condemning the act not merely as theft but as sacrilege. One declared, "To steal from the dead is to steal from eternity. It shows contempt for God, for memory, for every soul that walks this earth." The weight of public emotion pressed heavily on the trial. Public reaction. Outside the courthouse, crowds gathered daily, holding up signs that read, "Respect the dead and justice for our families." Newspapers printed lurid illustrations of men carrying tombstones through the night, their faces twisted with greed. Yet some editorials took a more nuanced view. A Devereux published a piece titled "Poverty's Hand in Crime," pointing out that Ian had once been a cemetery worker dismissed for stealing scraps of stone. The editorial argued that the real crime was the city's neglect of its poor, which drove men to such acts. The tension between condemnation and compassion gave the trial a strange atmosphere. Moral outrage mingled with social critique. Ian's own words. When it was his turn to speak, Ian surprised the court. He did not deny the thefts. Instead, he spoke bluntly, in the plain voice of a man who had long stopped caring for appearances. "I worked those cemeteries for years," he said. "I dug graves, I laid slabs. I saw how the rich spent fortunes on marble while the poor rotted in the ground with nothing but wood. What use is stone to the dead? The living need bread." Some in the gallery muttered in agreement, others hissed in disgust. Ian's words captured the heart of the matter. Was his crime simply theft, or was it a symptom of deeper inequality? The verdict. After weeks of testimony, the jury returned its decision. Ian and his chief accomplices were found guilty of theft and desecration of graves. The sentence was harsh: 7 years of hard labor for Ian, 5 years for his closest partners, and shorter terms for the younger men who had confessed. The courtroom erupted, some cheering the verdict, others shaking their heads at the severity. Priests declared justice had been done. The newspapers praised the court for defending the dignity of the dead. Yet even as the sentences were passed, questions lingered. The larger implications. The cemetery thefts had exposed uncomfortable truths. The city had been forced to confront how poverty drove men to desperate acts. It also revealed corruption, as several builders and stonemasons who had purchased stolen marble escaped prosecution. The poor thieves had been punished, but the wealthier buyers were left untouched. For many, this was the real scandal, that the men who profited most were never in the dock. The cliffhanger. The sentencing of Ian Stainescu and his grave-robbing gang in 1907 should have closed the chapter on one of Bucharest's strangest scandals. Yet, as with so many crimes, the echoes lingered long after the guilty were marched off to prison. The theft of marble and iron from cemeteries was more than just an act of greed. It was a mirror held up to the city, reflecting both its poverty and its vanity. Life in prison. Ian was sent to Jalova prison, notorious even then for its harsh conditions. The 7-year sentence was considered severe, though many argued it was fitting for a man who had desecrated the graves of the city's dead. Reports from guards suggested that Ian remained defiant even behind bars. "He said the living mattered more than the dead," one guard recalled later. Even in chains, he claimed he was no thief, but a man taking from the rich to feed the poor. His fellow inmates gave him a peculiar kind of respect, not for his crime itself, but for the brazenness with which he carried it out. Among criminals hardened by robbery and violence, Ian's theft of marble slabs seemed almost absurd, and yet it had shaken the entire city. The forgotten accomplices. While Ian bore the brunt of the punishment, some of his accomplices quietly slipped into obscurity after their shorter sentences. A few returned to work as laborers, others drifted into petty crime. What none could escape, however, was the stigma of being the men who stole from the dead. In Bucharest's working-class neighborhoods, even the desperate whispered about them with a mix of pity and contempt. The youngest member of the gang, just 17 at the time of his arrest, later claimed he had been lured by promises of easy money. His testimony, recorded decades later, revealed the truth of their operations. They were not hardened villains, but poor men exploiting knowledge of the cemeteries for survival. The silent beneficiaries. One of the lasting frustrations of the case was how few of the buyers of the stolen stone faced any consequences. Builders who had purchased cheap marble and iron fences were quietly let off. Some bribed officials, others simply claimed ignorance. It was whispered that several respectable homes and even municipal buildings in Bucharest bore stone that had once marked graves. These rumors were never confirmed, but they haunted the city. Families visiting cemeteries sometimes pointed to polished staircases or paving stones and asked, whose name was once carved there? This unspoken legacy of the crime left a deeper scar than the thefts themselves. The public memory. In the years following the trial, Bucharest became more protective of its cemeteries. Guards were hired, fences strengthened, and priests urged families to visit graves more often. Bellu Cemetery, in particular, was transformed into a site of cultural pride, its ornate tombs restored and guarded as though to erase the shame of the thefts. But memory is not so easily erased. The phrase "Fura din cimitir," he steals from the cemetery, entered common speech as an expression for someone shamelessly dishonest. Children were warned that thieves might even take from the dead if left unchecked. Poverty and crime. Historians looking back at the case often emphasized its symbolism. The thefts revealed not only the desperation of Bucharest's poor, but also the arrogance of the city's wealthy, who built monuments that became irresistible targets. It was a collision of need and vanity, played out among the tombs. One commentator at the time wrote, "The living rob the dead because the living cannot live. Yet the dead are not dishonored by the theft, but by the poverty that compels it." This interpretation was controversial, but it stuck. The case was remembered not just as a crime, but as a story of social inequality carved into marble. The fate of Ion. Ion Stainescu completed his sentence and was released around 1914. By then, Europe was on the brink of war, and Romania itself would soon be drawn into the conflict. Ion, older and broken by prison, faded from public record. Some claimed he returned briefly to gravedigging, others that he died penniless. Yet in working-class neighborhoods, his name lingered. Some saw him as a villain, others as a bitter symbol of survival at any cost. For the wealthy, he remained a reminder that no monument was truly permanent. A haunting reflection. Standing today in Bucharest's Bellu Cemetery, one sees rows of grand marble tombs, iron fences glinting in the sun, statues of angels and saints standing watch. Yet beneath the beauty lies the shadow of that strange scandal. How many of these stones, people still ask, were once stolen? How many houses in the city carry foundations of the dead? The crime has long since passed, but the questions remain. It was never just about theft, it was about dignity, inequality, and the thin line between survival and sacrilege. Closing thought. The cemetery thefts of Bucharest did not alter history on a grand scale, but they did expose an unsettling truth, that even death itself offers no immunity from the struggles of the living. In a city where the poor went hungry and the rich built monuments of marble, crime found its way into the most sacred of spaces. And so one haunting question lingers still. When society fails the living, can we truly be surprised when the dead are robbed as well? Story 5. The forged lottery of a Bavarian clerk. In late 19th century Bavaria, lotteries were more than just games of chance. They were institutions sanctioned by the state, meant to raise revenue while offering ordinary citizens a tantalizing dream that a single ticket bought cheaply could transform their lives. For peasants, clerks, and shopkeepers alike, the lottery was a brief escape from the grinding predictability of daily life. It was in this context that a seemingly unremarkable civil servant, Franz Keller, found a way to exploit that dream and in doing so, orchestrated one of the strangest frauds of his time. A lottery forgery so bold, it shook Bavaria's trust in its own institutions. The clerk in the shadows. Franz Keller was, by all accounts, forgettable. He worked as a clerk in Munich's finance bureau, his days filled with ledgers and correspondence. Colleagues remembered him as polite but withdrawn, a man who neither drank heavily nor joined much in office chatter. He lived alone in a modest apartment, ate simple meals, and rarely drew attention to himself. But Keller harbored a private fascination: the lottery. He was not reckless enough to gamble heavily, but he studied it obsessively. He collected old tickets, memorized prize structures, and followed every drawing with care. To him, the lottery was less a gamble and more a system, one that, if studied long enough, might yield a loophole. Bavaria's lotteries. At the time, the Bavarian state lottery was one of the most popular in Europe. Drawings were public events, attended by crowds who watched numbered balls pulled from a rotating drum. Winning numbers were then printed in newspapers and posted on bulletin boards. Tickets were issued on thick, embossed paper with signatures and seals to prevent forgery. But the printing system was not flawless. Each district issued its own series, and records were often slow to move between towns. For someone with access to official stamps and papers like a clerk in the finance bureau, the system contained exploitable cracks. The first forgery. It began small. In 1889, Keller quietly forged a lottery ticket, copying the format of genuine ones he handled in his office. He used scraps of official paper, mimicked the seals, and filled in a winning number from a recent drawing. Then, instead of submitting it in Munich, he traveled to a smaller Bavarian town where clerks were less vigilant. The ticket was accepted. Keller received a modest payout, enough to test the system, not enough to raise suspicion. He returned to Munich quietly, his secret intact. A growing scheme. Over the next 2 years, Keller refined his methods. He experimented with inks, perfected signatures, and grew bolder. Each time, he targeted smaller offices, where officials lacked experience with fraudulent claims. At first, his winnings were small: 50 marks here, 100 there. But gradually, he moved up, forging tickets for larger prizes. By 1891, he had claimed several thousand marks in total, enough to afford luxuries he had never known before. Neighbors noticed he dressed better, his apartment decorated with fine furniture. Yet Keller remained cautious. What made his fraud peculiar was not just the forgery, but his methodical patience. He never attempted to win the grand prize. Instead, he aimed for second and third-tier winnings, which attracted less scrutiny. In this way, he sustained his scheme for years, slipping between the cracks of Bavaria's bureaucracy. The moment of ambition. Every long-running scheme eventually encounters a moment of ambition, the point where patience gives way to greed. For Keller, that moment came in 1892, when the lottery announced a record grand prize. The newspapers were filled with stories of hopeful gamblers, and the prize was so large that it stirred the entire kingdom. Keller, after years of careful deception, decided to take his chance. He forged not one but 3 tickets, each bearing the grand prize number. His plan was to submit them in different towns, staggered over weeks, so as not to arouse suspicion. It was a bold move, and it proved to be his undoing. The first claim. The first forged grand prize ticket was submitted in Augsburg. The officials, astonished at the winning claim, paid out with great ceremony. Keller walked away with a fortune far larger than any he had attempted before. For a moment, he believed his years of patience had paid off. He could vanish, wealthy, and never be caught. But greed is a poor companion to caution. Instead of fleeing, Keller pressed on with his plan. The suspicion. When a second identical ticket appeared in Nuremberg weeks later, alarm bells rang. The lottery officials, puzzled, checked their records. Only one winning ticket should exist. How could there now be 2? The Nuremberg clerk, suspicious, sent word to Munich. By the time Keller attempted to cash the third ticket in Regensburg, the fraud had been exposed. Officials delayed his claim under the pretense of verification. Police were summoned. When Keller realized he was trapped, it was too late. He was arrested on the spot, the forged ticket still in his hand. Public outrage. The scandal that followed was immense. Newspapers declared it the Bavarian lottery scandal. Citizens were outraged not only at Keller but at the lottery system itself, which had allowed a clerk to manipulate its records for years. The fact that the fraud had been uncovered only because of his greed for the grand prize made it all the more sensational. Keller's apartment was searched, revealing drawers full of forged tickets, half-finished seals, and newspaper clippings of past drawings. It became clear that his scheme had been going on far longer than anyone imagined. The cliffhanger. The arrest of Franz Keller sent ripples through Bavaria. Until then, forgery was usually associated with counterfeit banknotes or fraudulent deeds, not state lotteries. For many citizens, the very idea that a civil servant had undermined a system meant to embody fairness and chance was almost more offensive than theft itself. The newspapers pounced. Headlines such as "Clerk Cheats Fortune" and "The Lottery Scandal of Munich" appeared across the kingdom. Ordinary people, who for years had pinned their hopes on a numbered ticket, now wondered whether the system had ever been trustworthy. A case of betrayal. When Keller's trial opened in Munich in the spring of 1893, the courtroom was packed. Officials, journalists, and curious citizens crowded in, eager to see the man who had managed to trick the state. The prosecution framed the case as one of betrayal. Keller, they argued, was not merely a criminal, but a man who had violated the public trust. As a clerk in the finance bureau, he had access to official stamps, seals, and blank paper tools he had used to construct a counterfeit system of his own. One prosecutor thundered. He did not merely rob the state. He robbed the people of Bavaria of their faith in justice and chance. Evidence of the scheme. The evidence presented was overwhelming. From Keller's apartment, police had seized stacks of forged tickets, some completed, others in preparation. Handmade seals, carefully carved to mimic official emblems. Notebooks filled with drawings and prize numbers, showing years of meticulous study. Receipts from provincial lottery offices, confirming payouts. Clerks from Augsburg, Nuremberg, and Regensburg testified about the claims he had filed. Each remembered him clearly, his calm demeanor, his precise paperwork. None had suspected fraud at the time. What astonished many was the sheer patience of the scheme. Keller had begun small, perfecting his craft for years before attempting the grand prize. To some, this made him seem all the more dangerous. To others, it suggested a man consumed by obsession rather than greed. Keller's defense. Keller, facing the court, did not deny his actions, but he framed them differently. He claimed he had not meant to destroy trust in the lottery but to correct its injustice. He argued that the system preyed on the poor, offering false hope while enriching the state. "If fortune is an illusion," he told the court, "then what is the difference between a number drawn by chance and a number written by my hand?" It was a shocking defense, one that divided opinion. Some dismissed it as arrogance. Others saw in it a critique of a system that did indeed profit from the desperation of ordinary people. Public reaction. The public was transfixed. Letters to newspapers debated whether Keller was a criminal or a social critic disguised as one. In taverns, peasants muttered that he had only done what the rich did all the time: find ways to cheat the system. Still, most saw him as a thief who had mocked the dreams of countless citizens. For those who had spent their last coins on lottery tickets, Keller's fraud felt like a personal betrayal. The sentence. In the summer of 1893, the verdict was delivered. Keller was found guilty of forgery, fraud, and abuse of office. The court sentenced him to 10 years in prison, a harsh punishment meant to send a clear message. The state would not tolerate betrayal from within. But the case did not end with Keller's imprisonment. The scandal forced Bavaria to overhaul its lottery system. Tickets were redesigned with new watermarks, centralized records were introduced, and small-town offices were given stricter training in verification. The lottery continued, but never again with quite the same aura of innocence. Unanswered questions. Even as Keller was led to prison, questions lingered. Officials admitted they could not be certain how many of his forgeries had gone undetected. Had he claimed only a fraction of the winnings his notebooks suggested? Was Bavaria's lottery system riddled with counterfeit payouts no one would ever trace? For years afterward, rumors persisted. Whenever an unusual claim surfaced, whispers of Keller's scheme resurfaced. His name became shorthand for fraud. Another Keller ticket meant a document too good to be true. The cliffhanger. As Keller began his sentence in Munich's Stadelheim prison, Bavaria was left to reckon with the uncomfortable truth. If one quiet clerk could manipulate the lottery so easily, what other cracks might exist in the state's institutions? And for Keller himself, the question remained. Would 10 years behind bars extinguish his obsession, or would his mind, even in a cell, keep spinning new schemes of fortune and deception? When Franz Keller was led through the gates of Stadelheim prison in 1893, he was no longer the quiet clerk of Munich's finance bureau. He was infamous, a man whose name had become shorthand for betrayal and deception. Newspapers continued to follow his story, even after sentencing, and the shadow of his fraud lingered over Bavaria's lottery system for years. Yet the story of Keller did not end with his imprisonment. The aftermath of his crimes rippled outward, shaping public opinion, altering the lottery industry, and leaving behind questions that remain unresolved to this day. Prison years. In Stadelheim, Keller's reputation preceded him. Some inmates regarded him with respect, admiring the audacity of his scheme. Others mocked him, insisting he was a fool who had risked everything for paper fortunes. Guards considered him a model prisoner, quiet, obedient, unremarkable. But those who knew him best suspected that even behind bars, Keller's mind was busy. He continued to request books on mathematics, printing, and finance. He kept notes, sketching ticket designs in the margins of prison newspapers. One guard later testified that Keller seemed haunted by numbers, as if he could not let go of the obsession that had defined his life. The public memory. Outside prison walls, Keller's case became a cautionary tale. Bavaria's newspapers revisited the scandal whenever questions of public trust arose. Teachers referenced him in schools when warning students about dishonesty. In taverns and village squares, his name surfaced in jokes and proverbs. "Don't try to play Keller with me," someone might say when a neighbor seemed less than honest. For all his anonymity before the fraud, Keller became immortalized in the folklore of petty deceit. Reform of the lottery. The state, embarrassed by how easily Keller had manipulated its system, moved quickly to strengthen safeguards. Tickets were redesigned with watermarks and new inks, making forgery harder. Claims had to be verified through centralized records in Munich, preventing duplicate submissions across towns. Clerks were trained to examine seals more carefully and to delay large payouts until verification was complete. These reforms, while costly, restored some measure of trust. Citizens continued to buy tickets, though always with the memory of Keller's scheme in the background. In a way, his crime had improved the lottery by forcing modernization. Yet the irony remained. One man's deception had made the system more secure than the state itself had ever managed. Release and disappearance. Keller served nearly his full sentence. When he was released around 1902, he was a changed man, older, thinner, with a reputation that barred him from any return to civil service. For a brief time, journalists tried to follow him, hoping for a sensational post-prison story. But after a few sightings in Munich taverns, he vanished from public view. Rumors abounded. Some said he emigrated to America under an assumed name. Others believed he moved to a rural village, living quietly until his death. Still others whispered that he never gave up forgery, that he simply shifted from lottery tickets to private contracts or counterfeit bills. The truth was never confirmed. Keller's disappearance only deepened the mystery surrounding him. The broader meaning. Keller's forgery was, in many ways, more than just a crime. It was a reflection of the vulnerabilities in modernizing societies. Bavaria, like much of Europe at the time, was caught between tradition and bureaucracy. Systems were expanding: lotteries, railways, financial offices, but their safeguards had not yet caught up. Keller's scheme revealed how fragile trust could be. The lottery depended not on chance alone, but on the belief that the process was fair. By undermining that belief, Keller had committed a crime against confidence itself. Echoes in other cases. Keller's scandal was not unique. Across Europe, similar frauds emerged in the following decades. In Austria, clerks were caught manipulating postal sweepstakes. In Italy, counterfeiters forged lottery bonds. Each time, comparisons to Keller appeared in the press. His case became a reference point, the quiet bureaucrat who had dared to cheat fortune. Even into the 20th century, criminologists cited him when discussing how insider knowledge could be weaponized against institutions. Reflection. For us, looking back, Keller's story feels almost quaint compared to the grand scandals of modern finance. His winnings, though significant at the time, pale beside the fortune stolen in later frauds. And yet, the core lesson remains relevant. Institutions built on trust are always vulnerable to those who understand their inner workings too well. Keller was not a violent criminal. He never carried a weapon, never shed blood. His crime was one of patience, intellect, and obsession. And in that sense, it was far more unsettling, for it suggested that anyone, given access and determination, might find a way to bend the system in their favor. Closing thought. As the lights dim on Keller's story, one question endures. Was he a man undone by greed, or a mirror held up to the flaws of his society? Perhaps the most unnerving part of his legacy is that we will never know how many of his forged tickets slipped through unnoticed quiet victories of deception, buried forever in Bavaria's ledgers. Story 6. The Postcard Poisoner of Lyon. At the turn of the 20th century, the French city of Lyon was a place of growing industry, vibrant cafes, and the clatter of new electric trams. It was also a city that prided itself on refinement and civic order. Yet beneath the surface of elegance, crime festered in unusual forms. Few, however, were as strange or as unsettling as the case of the so-called postcard poisoner. A city of correspondence. In 1905, Lyon was awash in paper. The postcard craze had taken hold of Europe, and Lyon's citizens sent millions each year. They carried holiday greetings, quick notes between friends, and sometimes romantic secrets. The postal service was the nervous system of the city, swift, affordable, and ubiquitous. It was this very ubiquity that made the crime so alarming. The poison did not come through food, nor through shadowy alleys, but in envelopes and postcards dropped innocently into the Morning Post. The first victims. The first case occurred in a modest neighborhood near Courtroom. A woman named Madame Briand received a postcard in the spring of 1905. The front bore a watercolor of the Rhône River, a common tourist image. On the back was a brief, unsigned note, "To remember a pleasant afternoon." Shortly after handling the card, Briand complained of nausea and dizziness. Within hours, she was gravely ill. Doctors were baffled. She survived, but her health never fully recovered. In the weeks that followed, two more cases emerged. A bookseller and a grocer, both of whom received mysterious cards and suffered sudden poisoning symptoms. This time, doctors detected traces of arsenic on the edges of the paper. The newspapers seized on the mystery. Who would lace postcards with poison? Why these particular victims? And how could the city's trusted postal system be turned into a weapon? Panic in Lyon. As reports spread, panic gripped the public. Citizens hesitated to open their mail. Families handled letters with tongs or gloves. Postmen, once welcomed at every door, found themselves viewed with suspicion. The municipal council convened in emergency sessions, desperate to calm the city. For the police, the investigation was unprecedented. They had little experience with poison delivered by post. Detectives examined dozens of postcards, tracing handwriting and postmarks, but the sender was careful, choosing common designs, vague notes, and postboxes far from the victims' homes. Early suspicions. At first, theories abounded. Some suggested the poisonings were random, a lunatic attacking strangers for the thrill. Others whispered of business rivalries, as two of the victims were shopkeepers. But one pattern began to emerge. Each victim, it turned out, had been connected directly or indirectly to a certain tenant dispute in Lyon. They were all acquaintances, however distant, of a man named Henry Chazot, a minor clerk known for his quarrelsome nature. Police began to watch him closely. Chazot, the quiet suspect. Henry Chazot was not an obvious villain. He was a small man in his 40s with thinning hair and spectacles. He had no criminal record, no known expertise in chemistry, but he was known for holding grudges. Neighbors described him as the sort who never forgets a slight. When questioned, Chazot denied everything. Yet investigators noted his peculiar interest in stationery and the mail system. He was often seen in post offices, buying stamps in small quantities or browsing postcards at local kiosks. Most damning of all, police discovered that one of the poisoned cards had been purchased at a shop only a few blocks from his apartment. The medical puzzle. Doctors, meanwhile, faced their own challenge. The poison on the cards was not always lethal. Often it caused illness rather than death. This inconsistency puzzled investigators. Was Chazot experimenting with doses? Or was someone else testing methods of slow torment rather than outright murder? Arsenic, they knew, could be ground into a fine powder and adhered to ink or glue. On several cards, tiny crystals were visible under magnification, sprinkled along the adhesive edge of the stamp. Whoever prepared them was deliberate and methodical. Lyon in suspense. By late 1905, the city lived in a state of anxious curiosity. More poisoned postcards turned up, some causing only mild sickness, others nearly fatal reactions. The police were under immense pressure. Newspapers published daily updates, sometimes mocking the detectives for failing to catch a man armed only with ink and envelopes. Still, no arrest was made. Chazot remained a suspect, but evidence was circumstantial, and the poisoned cards kept arriving. The cliffhanger. The city of Lyon now faced a chilling question. Was Henry Chazot truly the man behind the poisoned postcards, or was he merely the unfortunate focus of suspicion, while a more cunning figure remained at large? And if the cards could arrive at any door, who would be the next to receive death sealed beneath a stamp? The case of the postcard poisoner had by now become the most discussed crime in Lyon. By early 1906, police had logged nearly 24 incidents, some resulting in only minor illness, others nearly fatal collapses. The randomness of the attacks terrified citizens. Housewives refused to touch the post without gloves, and businesses hesitated to open envelopes at all. The postmen themselves began carrying protective cloths, and whispers spread that the city might suspend mail deliveries altogether. The investigation, however, was beginning to shift from uncertainty toward methodical pursuit. At its heart was a new approach, to trace not the handwriting but the stamps. The stamp connection. Detectives in Lyon, frustrated by dead ends, decided to examine the origins of the postcards, postage stamps. Each poisoned card bore legitimate French stamps, ordinary Marian designs, indistinguishable from thousands in circulation. But when investigators examined several under magnification, they found faint marks along the edges, where someone had lifted the stamp and reapplied it with glue laced with arsenic. This discovery opened new possibilities. By interviewing shopkeepers across Lyon, police began to narrow down which post offices and kiosks had sold stamps later used on the poisoned cards. A pattern emerged. Many had been purchased in the Presqu'île district, not far from where Henry Chazot lived. Following Chazot, the investigation returned, inevitably, to Chazot. Surveillance teams reported that he continued to visit post offices and stationery shops, often buying only a few items at a time. Clerks described him as nervous, his hands trembling slightly when counting coins. When confronted again, Chazot remained calm. He admitted he was fond of postcards, particularly scenic ones of Lyon and its bridges. He even showed detectives a small personal collection, but he denied ever handling arsenic. The problem was that arsenic was common. Sold in powdered form for killing rats and vermin, it was available in nearly every hardware store. Ownership of arsenic proved nothing. The turning point, a surviving card. Then came a break. In February 1906, a tailor named Jean Voisin received a postcard but hesitated to touch it, having read about the poisonings. Instead, he delivered it directly to the police. Forensic testing confirmed that the glue beneath the stamp was laced with arsenic. This card was intact, unsullied by human contact. It provided pristine evidence of preparation. On the back was a brief note, with compliments. Detectives now had physical proof of poison before exposure to a victim. The card was studied intensively. The handwriting, while careful, bore faint similarities to documents from Chazot's office job. A handwriting expert hesitated to confirm outright but suggested a strong likelihood that it matched. The question of motive. Yet motive remained murky. Why would Chazot, a mere clerk, target shopkeepers and acquaintances with poison? Was it revenge? Some pointed to his past disputes, rent quarrels, petty arguments over debts, social slights at cafes. He was known for his bitterness, and neighbors admitted he often muttered about teaching people lessons. But critics of the case argued that this hardly explained the randomness. If Chazot sought revenge, why poison near strangers? Why risk discovery with such a convoluted method? The newspapers began to speculate. Perhaps this was not about personal grudges at all, but about the thrill of power. Perhaps the poisoner enjoyed watching a city tremble, knowing that every letter carrier could be an unwitting messenger of death. Escalation. In March 1906, matters escalated. A young clerk at a printing office collapsed after handling a postcard. Unlike earlier victims, he did not survive. His death transformed the case from one of harassment to outright murder. Public outrage erupted. The city council demanded swift justice. Police redoubled their efforts, fearing riots if no arrest came soon. The pressure was immense. Crowds gathered outside police stations, shouting, "Catch the poisoner." Editorials demanded harsher punishment, some even calling for the guillotine. The breakthrough. The breakthrough came from an unexpected angle. A bookseller in the Presqu'île reported a peculiar incident. Weeks earlier, a nervous man had asked whether he sold blank postcards with thicker paper. The description matched Chazot. Investigators searched his apartment once more, this time with greater thoroughness. In a locked drawer, they discovered a small collection of stationery supplies: ink bottles, glue pots, scissors, and most damning of all, a small vial of powdered arsenic. While none of this was definitive, the accumulation was compelling. Combined with the forensic link to the surviving postcard and witness testimony, prosecutors believed they had enough to proceed. The arrest. On the morning of April 3, 1906, police arrested Henry Chazot at his modest flat. He protested his innocence, declaring that the arsenic was for killing rats in the building. He insisted he had been made a scapegoat by gossiping neighbors. But the public rejoiced. Crowds gathered as he was led away, shouting curses and relief in equal measure. For Lyon, the terror seemed at last to have a face. The trial approaches. Yet even as the indictment was prepared, questions lingered. Much of the evidence was circumstantial. The handwriting analysis was not conclusive. The vial of arsenic could indeed have been for vermin, and there was no direct witness who had seen him preparing the poisoned cards. The case was headed toward a sensational trial, one that would pit forensic science against the uncertainties of circumstantial suspicion. The cliffhanger. As Chazot sat in his prison cell awaiting judgment, one question weighed heavily over Lion. Was he truly the mastermind of the poisoned postcards, or had fear and coincidence conspired to condemn an innocent man? And if he was innocent, that meant the real poisoner was still free, perhaps, even continuing to slip arsenic beneath the edges of unsuspecting stamps. By the summer of 1906, the case of the postcard poisoner was at the center of French public attention. Newspapers in Paris and Marseille dispatched correspondents to Lyon, eager to witness what promised to be one of the strangest trials in the Republic's history. The courtroom was packed daily, the air thick with anticipation. Henry Chazot, the small, bespectacled clerk accused of terrifying an entire city with arsenic-laced postcards, sat quietly at the defense bench. He wore a plain suit and held himself with a mixture of resignation and defiance. His appearance, meek, almost scholarly, seemed at odds with the sinister crimes attributed to him. The prosecution's case. The prosecution opened with a sweeping narrative. Chazot, embittered by petty disputes, had embarked on a campaign of vengeance. He chose postcards, they argued, as a vehicle for his hatred, ordinary objects turned into deadly weapons. Key evidence was presented. The surviving poison postcard delivered intact to the police. Experts testified that the handwriting likely belonged to Chazot. The arsenic vial found in his apartment, along with glue pots and stamps. Witnesses from shops and post offices who recalled his nervous purchases of stationery. The pattern of victims, many of whom had at some point crossed paths with Chazot in disputes, however minor. The prosecution painted him as a small man seeking large revenge. The defense's counter. The defense, however, was forceful. Chazot's lawyer argued that the evidence was circumstantial. Arsenic, after all, was common in households. Stationery supplies were ordinary possessions for a clerk. Handwriting analysis, they noted, was not an exact science, especially when the notes were short and anonymous. The defense also highlighted that several victims had no clear connection to Chazot. Was it reasonable, they asked, to believe that one petty clerk would risk everything to target people he barely knew? Could this not be the work of another, a disgruntled business rival, or even a malicious prankster escalating beyond control? Most importantly, the defense reminded the jury that no one had ever seen Chazot preparing or sending the poisoned cards. Expert testimony. A parade of experts took the stand. Chemists described how arsenic crystals had been applied beneath stamps and along the edges of postcards. Doctors recounted the symptoms of victims: nausea, dizziness, collapse. Some testified that doses were inconsistent, suggesting either a clumsy experimenter or someone intent on intimidation rather than consistent murder. One expert admitted under cross-examination that the surviving postcard might have been written by any number of hands with similar characteristics. This doubt rippled through the courtroom. Public opinion. Outside the trial, Lyon was divided. Many were convinced of Chazot's guilt, eager for closure after a year of fear. Others whispered that the authorities had rushed to judgment, desperate to calm the city by blaming the most convenient suspect. Newspapers fanned the flames. Some printed caricatures of Chazot as a demon of the post, while others published sympathetic sketches of a frail man caught in a storm of hysteria. The verdict. After weeks of testimony, the jury retired. They deliberated for more than 12 hours. Finally, in a hushed courtroom, the verdict was read: guilty of attempted murder but not guilty of premeditated homicide. Chazot was sentenced to 10 years of hard labor. The ruling satisfied some but left many unsettled. The court acknowledged that the evidence of murder was insufficient, but it accepted that he had at least attempted to poison through his postcards. As he was led away, Chazot proclaimed, "I am innocent. History will clear my name." Aftermath. With Chazot's conviction, the wave of poison postcards ceased. The city breathed easier. Postmen once again delivered letters without fear of carrying invisible death. Lyon's cafes filled with lively chatter instead of hushed speculation. Yet doubts lingered. Some historians argue that Chazot was indeed guilty, pointing to his bitterness and the forensic evidence of arsenic-laced glue. Others suggest he was a convenient scapegoat, punished more for calming public terror than for proven guilt. The truth may never be known. Reflections. The case of the postcard poisoner reveals more than a strange crime. It illustrates the fragility of trust in ordinary systems. The Postal Service, a symbol of connection, became a source of dread. The randomness of the poisonings reminded citizens how vulnerable they were, not to grand conspiracies, but to petty malice. Forensic science, too, was tested. The case pushed investigators toward closer examination of handwriting, chemical traces, and postal routes. It highlighted both the promise and the limitations of early 20th century criminology. Above all, it left an unsettling question. What kind of mind chooses postcards, tokens of friendship and memory, as instruments of fear? Closing thought. When you next sort through your mail, imagine living in a time when every letter carried the possibility of hidden death. The people of Lyon did not have to imagine, they lived it. And though the postcard poisoner faded into history, the unease he stirred remained. The reminder that sometimes the most ordinary objects can conceal the darkest of intentions. Story 7. The Vanishing Chemist of Warsaw. On a gray March morning in 1932, Warsaw awoke to the unsettling news that Dr. Antoni Czernik, a respected pharmacist and chemist, had vanished. His shop on Nowy Street, usually bustling with customers seeking tonics, powders, and the latest patent remedies, stood eerily quiet. The shutters were half drawn. The door was locked. Inside, when neighbors peered through the glass, they saw scattered papers on the counter, a teacup overturned, and most disturbingly, a broken vial that reeked of bitter almonds, the unmistakable scent of cyanide. The chemist was gone. The last sightings. Witnesses recalled seeing Czernik late the previous evening. He had closed his shop earlier than usual, citing a headache. A neighbor swore that around midnight she saw a dim light flicker in the shop's back room. Another claimed to have heard the faint sound of a carriage stopping outside. But by morning, Czernik had vanished without trace. Police quickly took interest. The chemist was not just a businessman. He had occasionally consulted for the Ministry of Health, advising on toxicology. His knowledge of poisons, his connections to laboratories, and his sudden disappearance made the situation ominous. The shop examination. Detectives entered the shop with caution. The broken vial of cyanide on the counter suggested either accident or warning. In the back room, they found ledgers of purchases, jars of rare compounds, and notebooks filled with formulas in Czernik's precise handwriting. Some passages had been hastily crossed out. Curiously, an entire shelf of arsenical compounds was missing. The jars had been carefully removed, leaving clean spaces on the wooden planks. Police assumed theft. Perhaps Czernik had been robbed, and in resisting, taken away. But if so, why were valuable items like gold scales and imported instruments untouched? Suspicions of espionage. The 1930s were a tense time in Poland. Rumors swirled of foreign agents seeking chemical knowledge for nefarious ends. Could Czernik have been abducted by spies? His background as a toxicologist certainly made him valuable. Investigators interviewed his colleagues at the ministry. Some described him as brilliant but secretive, prone to working late into the night on private projects. One colleague hinted that Chernik had recently grown paranoid, insisting that people were following him on his way home. Personal life under scrutiny. The investigation turned to Chernik's personal affairs. He lived alone in a modest apartment above the shop. His wife had died years earlier, leaving him solitary and withdrawn. Neighbors described him as courteous but distant, a man whose life revolved around his shelves of powders and his endless experiments. There was, however, one curious relationship: a younger woman named Zofia who visited the shop regularly. She was said to be a former student of his, occasionally helping with bookkeeping. When questioned, Zofia admitted that Chernik had confided fears to her claims that shadowy men were watching the shop. She dismissed them at first as paranoia, but in the days leading to his disappearance, he had grown more agitated, insisting that he was close to discovering something important. The mystery of the letter. A day after the disappearance, a letter arrived at the Warsaw police station. Written in Chernik's unmistakable hand, it read, "By the time you read this, I will be far from Warsaw. There are forces beyond your comprehension at play. Do not search for me. To do so would endanger you all." The letter was signed simply, AC. The police, skeptical, considered whether the letter had been coerced or forged. The handwriting experts were divided. Most said it was genuine, but a few pointed out odd irregularities, as if written in haste or under duress. A city on edge. The case captured public imagination. Newspapers ran headlines like "Pharmacist Spirited Away by Foreign Spies" and "The Cyanide Trail of Dr. Chernik." Ordinary citizens whispered theories that he had been murdered for his formulas, that he had run off with Zofia, or that he had poisoned himself after succumbing to madness. But the broken vial on the counter suggested something darker: a struggle, or a warning left behind. The cliffhanger. As detectives pieced through Chernik's journals, they found cryptic notes in the margins, sketches of chemical apparatuses, strange symbols, and repeated phrases in Latin. Mors venit per epistolas. Death comes through letters. Was this a clue to his fate, or the paranoid ramblings of a man unraveling under invisible pressures? The truth remained hidden, as Warsaw debated. Had Dr. Chernik been abducted, murdered, or had he vanished by choice into the shadows of espionage and poison? The days after Dr. Antoni Chernik's disappearance deepened the mystery rather than solved it. Warsaw police kept his shop sealed, but curious onlookers lingered outside, pressing faces to the glass as if the missing chemist might reappear among his bottles and balances. Detectives scoured the city, but every lead seemed to evaporate. And yet, behind the locked shutters of the shop, a more troubling story was beginning to emerge. The missing journals. Among Chernik's scattered notes, officers noticed gaps. His research journals were numbered meticulously, but volumes IV through VII were missing. Colleagues confirmed he guarded them jealously, sometimes carrying them under his coat when walking home. They contained, supposedly, formulas for experimental compounds, antidotes, but also toxins. Had these notebooks been stolen, or had Chernik himself hidden them before vanishing? The notion that they might now be in the hands of criminals or spies set the authorities on edge. The Zofia connection. Investigators brought Zofia back for deeper questioning. She admitted that Chernik had confided to her about letters that could kill. At first, she thought he was speaking metaphorically, perhaps alluding to poisoned ink, but he seemed deadly serious. In one conversation, he insisted he had been corresponding with someone abroad, an interested party, who demanded his formulas in exchange for large sums of money. Zofia swore she had begged him to stop, warning that such dealings were dangerous. He only shook his head, saying, "Knowledge has its own momentum. Once written, it must travel." The police began to wonder, had Chernik fallen into the world of clandestine chemical trade, selling recipes for toxins to foreign agents. If so, had he been abducted or silenced? The cyanide lead. The broken cyanide vial still troubled detectives. The shop's assistant, who occasionally cleaned, swore that vial had not been on the counter the day before the disappearance. Its presence seemed staged. Forensic tests confirmed the vial had been shattered deliberately, not by accident. Was it planted to mislead investigators, suggesting suicide or accident? Or was it Chernik's own warning, left behind in a final moment of resistance? Foreign eyes on Warsaw. By April, rumors spread that Chernik's disappearance had drawn the attention of foreign intelligence services. Soviet agents were whispered to have prowled Warsaw, eager to acquire toxicological knowledge useful for assassinations. Germany, too, was suspected. Their chemical industries had long been at the forefront of both medical and military applications. A Polish intelligence officer, speaking quietly to detectives, suggested Chernik had been under surveillance for months. He was, after all, a man of peculiar brilliance in a time when poisons were regarded not merely as criminal tools, but as weapons of statecraft. The anonymous witness. A breakthrough seemed to arrive when an anonymous tipster came forward. A coachman reported that on the night of Chernik's disappearance, he had been hired to drive two men and a third figure, slumped and silent, toward the outskirts of the city. The figure, he swore, wore spectacles and a dark coat like Chernik's. When pressed, the coachman admitted he had been paid generously and told to forget the ride. But the details matched the neighbor's claim of hearing a carriage near midnight. Detectives followed the lead to the road near the Vistula River, but no trace of the chemist or his captors was found. The letter scrutinized. Meanwhile, Chernik's farewell letter continued to divide investigators. Handwriting experts confirmed its authenticity, but the odd phrasing, "forces beyond your comprehension," struck many as theatrical. Some argued it was written under duress. Others suspected forgery, using samples of his script stolen from his ledgers. Zofia suggested another possibility, that Chernik himself had staged his disappearance. He had spoken often of starting anew, of leaving behind the burdens of knowledge. Could he have deliberately vanished, leaving Warsaw to believe in abduction while he began a new life abroad? Yet if so, why leave behind broken glass and missing journals? Why vanish without taking money, clothes, or his most trusted possessions? Public fascination and fear. Warsaw was divided between fascination and dread. Some saw Chernik as a victim of espionage, a man too knowledgeable for his own safety. Others whispered he had gone mad, consumed by the fumes of his own laboratory. Children were warned not to linger near apothecaries lest the chemist's fate befall them. Newspapers offered lurid speculation. Did Warsaw chemist invent a super poison? Screamed one headline. Was he the pawn of foreign spies? Asked another. The case became more than a local mystery. It was now a national question about security, science, and loyalty. The cliffhanger. Then came the discovery that unsettled even the most hardened detectives. A postcard mailed days after Chernik vanished, bearing only the words, "The ink carries death, stop searching." It was unsigned. The handwriting resembled Chernik's, but once again, experts were divided. Had the missing chemist himself sent the warning, or had his captors mocked the investigators with a grim echo of his research? The mystery deepened, leaving Warsaw to wonder. Was Chernik still alive, communicating cryptically from captivity, or was this the cruel handwriting of his killers, using his own science as taunt? By the summer of 1932, the disappearance of Dr. Antoni Chernik had grown from a police inquiry into a national obsession. Newspapers printed weekly updates, often fueled by rumor more than fact. The chemist's face became familiar to every citizen. Round spectacles, neat mustache, a distant gaze captured in the single surviving portrait. The postcard warning about ink carrying death left investigators in a fever of speculation. Was Chernik alive, held against his will, or had someone else penned the cryptic message to keep police guessing? A body that was. In late July, fishermen on the Vistula River reported finding a body caught in reeds near the riverbank. Word spread quickly. The chemist had been found at last. Crowds gathered, journalists scribbled, and police arrived to retrieve the corpse. But when the remains were examined, the body was not Chernik's. It belonged instead to a dockworker reported missing weeks earlier, his death likely the result of drink and drowning. The case seemed unrelated, yet the disappointment was palpable. The river, it seemed, was mocking Warsaw with false answers. The secret police file. Around this time, a leak revealed that the Polish intelligence service had maintained a file on Chernik. The chemist, it turned out, had been under discreet surveillance. His correspondence with foreign contacts, some in Berlin, others in Moscow, had raised suspicions. Officials feared he might be exchanging formulas for poisons or antidotes in return for money or promises of protection. Yet the file also painted him as a conflicted figure, a man simultaneously eager for recognition and fearful of its consequences, a patriot but one tempted by the lure of secretive patrons. Zofia's revelation. Months after the disappearance, Zofia revealed a startling detail she had previously withheld. Days before he vanished, Chernik had entrusted her with a sealed envelope, instructing her to deliver it only if something happened to him. When she finally opened it in the presence of police, it contained a single sheet of paper, scrawled with chemical formulas and one phrase underlined 3 times. The letters kill. The handwriting was unquestionably Chernik's. To some, this was evidence he had truly stumbled upon a method of transmitting toxins through seemingly harmless correspondence, perhaps by lacing inks or envelopes with trace compounds. To others, it was a symbolic statement of his paranoia, an allegory for how words and secrets themselves could destroy. A trail to nowhere. Through autumn, investigators chased whispers across Poland and beyond. Sightings of Chernik came from Berlin cafes, Prague apothecaries, even Parisian libraries. Each lead collapsed under scrutiny. Some insisted he had defected, living under a false identity in another country. Others were certain he had been killed the night he vanished, his body disposed of in the Vistula or buried in some hidden cellar. The missing journals never surfaced. The trial that never came. By 1933, the case had cooled, though its shadow lingered. Warsaw courts briefly considered trying Zofia for withholding evidence, but public sympathy was with her. She was seen as loyal, not complicit. Without a body, without proof of crime, there was no trial, no closure. The shop on Nowy Swiat remained shuttered. Dusk gathered on its counters, and eventually the building was sold. Yet passers-by claimed that at night, the faint smell of chemicals still drifted from its cracks, as if Chernik's presence had never entirely left. Reflections on the vanishing. The story of Dr. Chernik endures less as a solved case than as a meditation on knowledge, secrecy, and fear. He was a man who lived among poisons, both literal and metaphorical. Whether he was taken by foreign agents, consumed by paranoia, or chose to vanish into the anonymity of another life, his disappearance illustrates the perilous border between science and shadow. Poland in the 1930s stood on the brink of upheaval, caught between rival powers who valued chemistry as much as strategy. In that crucible, a solitary pharmacist became a symbol of genius misused, of secrets too dangerous to hold, and of a life swallowed whole by forces larger than himself.